comes down to computers communicating.
The information superhighway can be a confusing mix of on-ramps and off-ramps.
Bitcoin is worthless artificial gold.
Is it still rat poison?
Probably rat poison squared.
We need to get into the world of, okay, this is actually foundational technology.
What the Internet of Money does is it creates a single network which can do a microtransaction to a gigatransaction.
The Internet is going to be one of the major forces for reducing the role of government. The one thing that's missing, but that will soon be developed, is a reliable e-cash.
Alrighty, gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Final Settlement. Today is Monday, May 5th, 2025. Very special episode. We've got a great guest on, Abubakar Nur Khalil, a friend of the show. He's been on before, so welcoming him back. Also an advisor to Early Riders. So very excited to chat through some topical news that's been happening in the space over the past couple weeks, and also just catch up with Abu. How you doing, man?
I'm doing good. Thanks again for having me, guys.
Yeah, we've got a big list. Liam put together a list. I think let's just jump right into it. A good place to start is the Nigerian government passing some laws related to digital assets and Bitcoin. Liam, you want to preface this one, and then we can kick it to Abu?
Yeah. Well, this was actually written by you, Abu. So you're going to be the one who's going to be able to speak to this the best. But recently, I may butcher his last name, but the Nigerian president signed into law saying that Bitcoin is a security in Nigeria. It sounds like this is, not what many expected in terms of, Bitcoin not being a security. We know that based on, everything that's happening here in the US, but it does offer some regulatory clarity for the digital assets ecosystem, understanding how different founders and people in the space can operate. Would love to hear your thoughts, Abu, on the initial reaction by institutions, founders, everybody in the space over in Nigeria to this regulatory ruling.
Yeah, certainly. I think it'll be good to preface this with kind of an analogy to capture both the sentiment and honestly just the reality of the regulation on the ground for a lot of us is imagine you're in a restaurant and you essentially have a bowl of soup that you want to eat. Request from the waiter to might bring you a spoon. And then rather than bringing you a spoon, he brings you a knife. Now, it's not impossible to still, eat the soup with the knife, but it just makes it very, very challenging. And at least some see it as the beginning of a very long conversation, pretty much. So that's essentially what's happening with this regulation. I think for a lot of us on the ground, especially over the years, I can definitely say personally, talking with regulators, it's been very, very challenging in the sense that there are a lot of things to grok because it's been very, very difficult given the increased amount of capital coming in from places outside of Bitcoin, the digital asset space, whether it's stablecoins, etc. So for a lot of them, they still have difficulty in disambiguating between Bitcoin and everything else. And I think that's kind of emblematic by the reason why they bundled everything up. I think it's also positive in the sense that a lot of the stuff happening outside of Bitcoin, because for a lot of Bitcoiners, we're mostly concerned obviously with Bitcoin, but I think for the stability, generally speaking, of the digital asset space, especially here in Nigeria, where there's quite a lot of fraud as well as individuals trying to scam off of the marketing and hype of Bitcoin, it's a very good cleanup that they've done essentially by wrapping everyone under a succinct law. That kind of increases three things I say that are very pertinent, which is one, making Ponzi's explicitly prohibited according to the ISA, which is the Securities Act that you're talking about. And then two, also instituting fines and penalties up to prison sentences as well for people engaged in Ponzi schemes. Another one I think is very interesting is also making distinction between the type of exchanges that we have here on the ground. So some are allowed to actually engage in specific assets, which might be just Bitcoin exclusively. So that essentially captures a lot of the fintechs here on the ground, as well as giving the latitude for some of these other exchanges that list stable coins, everything else really as one. And I think it's important to also note that despite a lot of people feeling, which, part of that bucket, that this is not acceptable regulation, it's definitely a first step, given the fact that we haven't had regulation. And this is the first time the government is actually accepting Bitcoin as an actual legitimate asset on the ground. So the challenge right now really for us is to unpack all the aspects of this regulation that doesn't fit Bitcoin and kind of move it into a better direction. But I say it's also important to note that under this law, technically any exchange that also enlists a commodity would still be regulated by the SEC in Nigeria. So even if we were to regulate this as a commodity, if someone were to list this, essentially they'll still fall under the same regulation. So definitely a lot of unpacking that has to be done. I think for entrepreneurs kind of split in between two buckets. One is those who fiercely believe that this is definitely bad regulation, and the sooner we get to acting, moving into a better direction, the better. And on the other hand, a lot of folks definitely just see this as a good first step. I think you're going to see a mix between entrepreneurs trying to figure out exactly how they need to position themselves in the interim to be compliant with these regulations, especially on the KYC ML side. Obviously, the implication for that will be higher costs, especially on the hiring side for folks to actually help clean that up. And then on the other side, really, I think for us, it provides at least a small headway for them to kind of innovate and start building more officially, as Heritage mentioned in the space.
Yeah, that's a great recap. I think it's the analogy is a good one. It's not impossible. It helps maybe incrementally, but I think it's there's a couple things to remember. One of them, and we see this in the US around capital formation, like you need some kind of framework for capital to come in, institutional capital, individuals to feel like they can get a return on their capital because this thing is not, shadow banned, which I think in a lot of countries outside of the US or specifically in the Middle East and North Africa might be. But it brings up an age old, like, it's kind of not fair, but it's like, do you want to make money or do you want to be right, in the sense of, if you want to be right, there's a natural way to do things in Bitcoin. You could talk about being money versus a currency or digital, but it's like, or do you want to actually just meet the market where they're at? And I've always, as you, Abu, and in the group here, we have a vast, like, wide-ranging group of friends, and they all come from different angles, and some want to be extremely principled, but sometimes being principled, even though it's right, it may not be the thing that is right at the moment when it comes to meeting the market and actually furthering the cause. And so it seems like that a little bit from the outside looking in. It's like, look, something's better than nothing. And if you have no framework and everyone's looking over their head or afraid to like operate a business, well, you need capital to start to form. And then the other part of that, sadly, is, as we know, all cryptocurrencies will naturally trend towards zero in Bitcoin terms. It's still like that capital. And again, you can make the case it's all just destroying capital, but we've seen this in the US. Actually, that's overhead and overhang that give like more clarity or more, like a shielding for Bitcoin to do its thing before the market wakes up and realizing how like impactful it is, but also it brings in capital that is also used to build other infrastructure that will benefit Bitcoin. And we've seen that with like the blockchain initiatives in different states. They're never really Bitcoin initiatives because there's only so much Bitcoin capital that will invest, but there's plenty of crypto exchange capital. And so that also, I think, would be a beneficial byproduct of there's regulatory clarity now around cryptocurrencies and more capital is going to come in. That capital will naturally flow to the hardest asset. And over time, the market will be able to form in the right way. At least that's what it seems like from the outside, just based on what we've seen across the world.
Yeah, well, certainly. And it's also important to note that it's under this regulation, Bitcoin isn't going to be taxable, at least for the time being.
That's interesting. Is that like cap gains in like income tax, or what is that, all securities that aren't taxable?
So right now, it's a bit vague in terms of whether it would be taxed based on capital gains or personal tax, but there's definitely nothing with regards to taxation right now.
Interesting.
So is that kind of where you land on it, Abu? Like, this is better than what was the status quo. This is better than nothing. It's a first step in the right direction, even though it's a crude, knife versus spoon first step. Is that kind of your takeaway from this?
No, certainly. And I can definitely tell you, like, hand on heart, for the last couple of years, it's been definitely difficult managing the lack of regulatory clarity, but also talking to LPs as well as other entrepreneurs on the ground, just trying to navigate it. So, like I said, it's a good stopgap in the sense that the same way everything else is trying to lynch onto Bitcoin to be both relevant as well as regulated in a similar light, is the same way I feel that Bitcoin will use this as a way to also launch itself into appropriate regulation. So think of it as like the whole basket of both crap as well as Bitcoin being bundled into this regulation, and then just leaving this regulation specifically for things that are outright Ponzi's to be properly regulated by capital markets. And the largest overseer of this is obviously the SEC here in Nigeria. So it's definitely an interesting long combo that we'll have to have for the next possibly 2-3 years, but I think is worthwhile.
Yeah. No, that
Yeah, I
makes
mean,
sense.
we barely gotten that. It's like when I was thinking about the securities law and I saw you post on LinkedIn, it reminded me of how we kind of get lost in our own kind of like system of feeling, we're like complain here in the US of like how things are going and regulation. And the reality is like there's been market structure around Bitcoin as a commodity for, I don't know, maybe close to a decade now, where we're still figuring out in other regions. But it's also very contentious here with the, I think it's the FIT Act, which is ultimately figuring out the market structure where what the SEC will regulate and then what will be deemed a commodity. And that seems to be very contentious across both aisles on like who's going to oversee what. So we're still trying to figure it out here in the US. And that's after realizing that Bitcoin's a commodity. Now they're trying to figure out if these other cryptocurrencies are commodities. So I still think we have a long ways to go across the world.
No, 100%. And I think the benefit for us is we don't have too many stringent regulation around digital assets to begin with. So this was kind of a long time coming, given the fact that last year the SEC already started giving licenses to exchanges. So kind of figured down the line they'll likely be the ones regulating this. So it'll be really a battle of different regulators trying to pick apart different segments of the market. And I think that's going to play into our favor, to be honest, in the sense that we have to take apart this whole large omnibus regulation that we have for Bitcoin and just see what fits where. So I guess, the IRS here on the ground also play a part, as well as the SEC, as well as the CBN, et cetera. So it's definitely going to be an interesting next couple of years.
Got it. Maybe sort of just extending on this a little bit, could you talk a bit about just an update of Bitcoin entrepreneurship in Nigeria generally, and more broadly in Africa, and how you're seeing this piece of regulation and how that's sort of immediately impacting sort of how you're thinking about businesses in your portfolio of recursive capital, and also just people building in the space generally. Is this impacting their day to day and how they're about to go about going to market with various products and services, or is this is it kind of just a line in the sand now that there's a little bit more clarity to move forward on certain things? How is this impacting things on the ground, I guess, is a better way to phrase all of that.
Yeah, for sure. I think certainly the most immediate one would be an unlocking of larger amounts of capital just flowing into the country. I think in the last, I say maybe 18, 24 months, a lot of the conversations for a lot of the entrepreneurs that both support as well as we talk to here on the ground has been attracting foreign investments or capital from other VCs outside of recursive capital. And the challenge has been a lack of regulatory clarity, which obviously makes a lot of sense. Already this region is seen as risk. So I think that lack of regulatory clarity just increased that on there. I think now, given the fact that there is some clarity, I think you'll start seeing a lot more capital coming, say probably in Q1 2026 in terms of investments from companies using outside just conventional Bitcoin VCs. I think what's interesting though on the ground for them is there's definitely been a battle in the last 3 years for a lot of entrepreneurs in terms of just figuring out whether what they're doing is either legal or allowed. When's the next regulation that will come out of X government agency that will clamp down on them? So I think now that everyone is aware where we need to go as an industry in terms of who the apex regulator is for our space, which is the Nigerian SEC, I think a lot of the entrepreneurs really are just having to figure out two parts. So on the KYC AML side, but also on the capital side too. Because again, like I said, one of the consequences for this regulation is that it'll likely favor a lot of folks that already are well capitalized in the ground, which will be some of the requirements for getting licenses from the SEC. And it's important to also note that there isn't exactly a crypto license as of yet for a lot of these exchanges. So it's still going to take some time before this materializes into actual costs on the ground for our companies. But I think for the time being, it's definitely going to be both the cost in terms of just the burden that will cost them structurally from adjusting these things all the way up to trying to figure out what the next regulation is and how they can position themselves. But like I said, it's going to be a lot of difficulty and a lot of discomfort for the meantime. But then it's our job, I feel, as both VCs as well as stakeholders on the ground to kind of move the regulatory conversation, also including things like Bitcoin mining to move them into a more well-nuanced conversation as opposed to just Bitcoin being a security.
Yeah, that makes sense. And maybe switching gears a little, tying into the rest of the news, we've been talking about the past probably 3 weeks. It feels like there's a fervor of in the Middle East region, counting to Asia Pacific when it comes to specifically like the UAE and stable coins and the banking integrations that are happening. I believe Pakistan, among one other nation, added Binance, and I believe it was CZ as advisors to their sovereign council. how are you thinking about that from this legislation as well as just in the region, the flow of capital when it comes to stables and Bitcoin, and just like overarching, what are you seeing? At least in the West, we've seen this kind of like new administration pop up, and everything feels like it's there's a lot of activity happening in M&A. Obviously, like in the West, Tether feels like they're making a large entrenchment into different forms of liquidity and flow of funds. And then it feels like a little bit in the East, you're seeing Binance have a larger positioning. Just curious, like what you're seeing and all, how that all ties together.
It's interesting. I think, so there are a lot of dynamics. I think one of the large ones, which is just, tethering off of what you just said with regards to the Trump admin, is for a lot of the African countries that are just thinking geopolitically raw in terms of having better deal terms with the US, they are seeing the stance of the US now being a lot more pro-crypto. It's also playing into our favor to a certain extent, in the sense that a lot of these conversations are taking a lot more seriously on the government side, leading up until the recent regulation that came out. I do feel like it played a huge part in terms of taking the space pretty seriously and even revising the law that governs the SEC here on the ground, which is actually what this act does. I think what will be interesting to see is the conversation moving away now, which, in my opinion, already has, from kind of this more speculatory, we can ignore this, to, okay, how are we going to organize the country in terms of our economics, whether it's treasury management all the way up to dealing with the whole stablecoin situation. Because again, FX has been a huge issue for us here in Nigeria, just in terms of both repatriating into companies, but also making sure that we keep a reasonable flow between the Naira and kind of the US dollar too. So stablecoins are definitely going to play a huge part in kind of the calculus in terms of both the regulatory side, but at least how the government is taking a look at structuring our finances, whether it's regulation with the Central Bank of Nigeria all the way up to some more regulation that will likely come as a result of this act. I think a more interesting dynamic that I'm yet to see happen is the conversation around Bitcoin mining and how that affects both our energy challenges here on the ground and maybe the positioning on the regulatory side toward Bitcoin, both in a favorable light as well as some more material way. I think, the dynamic on the Trump admin being pro-crypto is definitely going to play a huge advantage in our sense, both on the regulatory side and kind of how entrepreneurs in Nigeria move. And I think, again, Bitcoin mining is going to play a huge role as well due to solving a lot of the energy issues we have on the ground. So I say maybe those three dynamics will be very interesting. And obviously, Tether will likely make some more plays here on the continent, given the clarity that we're starting to see. The only thing I would say is other countries are looking to Nigeria now, given we're technically on the forefront now of Bitcoin regulation or digital asset regulation. So I do hope they learn from the mistakes that we're making along the way, as opposed to just taking on the regulation that we have currently, as Bitcoin being a security all the way up to other things that might pop up.
Historically, is that kind of the case? Do other countries in Africa look at what Nigeria does and sort of try to replicate it, or is there some give and take in terms of they could do something different or potentially superior to what was just enacted?
I say it's a mix, and I think the determinant is likely the structure of the country in terms of the regulatory bodies, if they mirror closely the Nigerian regulatory bodies. So Kenya is a good example where the CBN traditionally, just like Nigeria, well, I say the Kenya Central Bank, just like Nigeria's central bank, were kind of leading regulation for a while, all the way up to looking at the SEC. So I really hope that doesn't get mirrored. And I think an interesting development that recently happened is, I think, as a result of the announcement from HRF's grants, they gave a grant to the Africa Bitcoin Institute, essentially, which will be an interesting arm coming out of Africa in terms of the regulatory side. I feel that would play a very interesting role if done right in terms of crafting regulation that's a lot more productive, given, taking a look at case studies, presenting to governments in a more formalized and organized way, as opposed to the way we've done as like individuals from the ecosystem.
Everyone, hope everyone had a great weekend. We had a fantastic quick rip with Abu Bakr from Recursive Capital, touching on all things related to Bitcoin technology and also what he's doing on the investment side of the space. It was timely because Nigeria just had an update around their legislation, and which gave some regulatory clarity into that side of the world. But then also touching on all things related to the topical point in the ecosystem around consensus core and the block size limit. I hope you guys enjoyed the show. A quick comment from Onramp. We have some insanely exciting things that we're going to be announcing later on this week in the market. If you want to see them first, I would encourage you to at least subscribe to our research. As you guys know, we offer the most robust custody solution in the market. No longer do you have to worry about, do you have a hardware device that secures the majority of your Bitcoin, or do you have to leave it on a third-party exchange? Now there's multi-institution custody, where you can get the benefits of self-custody, segregated on-chain, the ability, but also the ability to move those assets if you're traveling. You don't have to take your hardware device, but you also don't have to rely on a third-party custodian. There's going to be a lot more coming from our business over the course of the next couple of weeks. One thing to call out, because we've seen an uptick, you can self-onboard. So if you're interested in signing up but don't necessarily want to talk to anybody or just want to go through the onboarding flow, it's pretty awesome. You can go through relatively fast. What used to take me and my previous firm 2 to 8 weeks to get somebody on board is now about 2 to 8 minutes. Yeah, go to shoot us a note, Michael at onrampbitcoin.com or hello at onrampbitcoin.com if you want to get involved or if you want to get a sneak peek at what we're going to announce later on this week. Hope you enjoy the show.
Gotcha. You mentioned something in there around mining, which I found interesting. And going back to what you were saying previously around, this piece of regulation in Nigeria and sort of lumping everything together, do you see Bitcoin mining as an avenue to basically distinguish Bitcoin? Like, this is fundamentally different. There's a different consensus mechanism. There's a different, way that this actually impacts society in a really positive way. Do you see that as sort of a line of sight to just better distinguishing, like, Bitcoin is very different than the rest of this?
No, 100%. And I think it's kind of two parts. And one is the US side with, the SEC. I think it was last year, like, proof of work, Bitcoin mining is totally separate from everything else. I think we kind of lean into that as like kind of precedence given. To some extent, we do mirror US regulation a lot of the time just to be compliant, obviously, to help with both bilateral agreements and things like that. But I think the more interesting angle really is the difference is very, very stark from just communicating to them that Bitcoin has no issuer, has no, it's decentralized, etc. I think a more material way of seeing that in action is through Bitcoin. For two reasons. One is the fact that it provides electrification from day one for a lot of communities. And the mini grid approach that we've been using and championing hasn't been effective given the fact that there's no off-taking of that demand initially. So a lot of the projects are just laden with a lot of loans and debt. So pretty much a lot of that, I think, will be helped up by Bitcoin mining coming into the continent. But two, I'd say once we achieve energy independence, which I think Bitcoin mining will play a huge role in doing, I think the conversation will stop being around Bitcoin isn't different from everything else. It's around how we can further kind of capture value from Bitcoin as an asset, as also an infrastructure really as a continent, and then moving away from looking at it as just one bundled up ecosystem. So I think we'll have a lot more nuance to Bitcoin mining in my opinion.
Yeah, there's a piece we talked about it. I have this book behind me. It's called The Prize, and it just breaks down. It's called The Epic Quest for Oil, Money, and Power, and just breaks down from like the late 1880s in Titusville, Pennsylvania. I haven't fully gone through it, but it's the notion of we were talking about before this call started that like Luke Groman, Arthur Hayes, and others all reference their hard money in amount of barrels per oil, like a troy ounce or a BTC. And there's something to like Bitcoin's, I know it's obviously digital gold, but digital oil in the sense that it's a proxy for oil. And, whatever those units are, you can move them faster across the world. And then like AI and all these other things that you'll be needed from an infrastructure perspective. It just kind of like changes the dynamic from being a toy or something that, everyone understands energy, artificial intelligence, compute, servers, and saying that like this thing will be running through it, I think helps in that. But you said something earlier that sparked the thought of consensus, and we don't have to go deep here, but I think it just happened coincidentally that there's this whole situation going on right now with core and updating and the block size, and you'll be able to at least summarize it better than we can. But would love to get maybe a layman's version of what's happening, and then any color you want to share. We don't have to go deep on it, but just I think the big thing is most individuals have no idea what's going on. They're probably barely starting to hear from something because, on Twitter, you're always a couple days ahead of before other people start catching on. But even by the time that happens, they still don't fully grok like what's the discourse, and then also like what actually are the likelihood of any changes and what's the process around that.
Yeah, sure. Like you mentioned, it's definitely a very dense topic. I can definitely see I'm being trying to catch up as well, seeing if it might arise as like a piece just to help with folks. But so far, in terms of what I would say is, first and foremost, if anyone's looking for context, Nostr is a much better source of signal for this conversation than Twitter, just in case, because there's a lot of just noise really coming from that. So in terms of looking at the sources, I'd say Nostr first, and then going all to the GitHub all the way up to the mailing list is very useful context. But the issue I find is, so it's twofold. One, there's a conversation around censorship happening, which I think there are legitimate concerns in the sense that you don't want to have vague laws, not necessarily laws, but vague rules of participation on project, or mirroring some of the, whether it's code of conduct with regards to other projects, just because of the sheer difference between Bitcoins, both development community and just how it works as a project versus everything else, even including other open source projects. So I think there's definitely legitimate concerns around that. I think some of it is kind of a misunderstanding on both sides in terms of some of the core folks communicating more effectively what they're doing versus some of the reception on the community's end. So I think with regards to that conversation, it'll likely be one of those things where we just have to have a more honest conversation around it and likely figure out what a middle ground is, because it's going to be a larger and larger issue given the fact that Bitcoin is such a huge, large, valuable asset that affects millions of lives around the world. So it's not a case where it's just a project, egos, etc. It's actually material. It's the difference between someone actually living, in my opinion, versus most likely dying or finding themselves in such a challenging situation. So that's on the censorship side. I think the interesting angle is that all of that came as a result of some of the work from the op return that's happening. So just to keep it clean, Bitcoin is essentially guarded by two types of rules, or I see two sets of rules or policies. So one, which a lot of people are familiar with, is on the consensus side, which is what dictates things like, the turnaround million coins, etc., what constitutes a valid transaction, invalid transaction, etc. But at the same time, because this is a peer-to-peer network, so you want to make sure that you have a tight grip on exactly the type of data that's being sent, ensuring that things are not being sent that are large, which will increase the resource requirements for individual nodes, which will affect things like decentralization. So there is a second level to this, which is called, the standardness rules. And that kind of guides three things, but two are more relevant to this conversation. So one is ensuring that there isn't spam just going around on the network. And two is ensuring that people don't make mistakes, given the fact that there are a lot of kind of transactions that you can make that are technically valid from the consensus laws, but aren't necessarily recommended for average individuals because they could lose their money, given the fact that it's complex, wallets don't support it, so you might end up most likely, more oftentimes than not, likely losing your funds. So those are two aspects of how it's governed. Now, the conversation around op return came as a result of the spam side. So ensuring that people aren't necessarily putting arbitrary amounts of data on chain. And the real way that was battled was introducing this operation code, which is, the op return itself. So the interesting angle is, unlike other times where people are trying to put in data, they put in things like the TXO set. So just to, communicate that more effectively, is essentially the state that is in charge of keeping track of all ownership of Bitcoins in the network essentially gets bloated because people are using that as a mechanism to actually put that on chain, as opposed to something op return, which allows you to prune it, aka you could actually discard it if you're running a node. So that technically doesn't affect individual nodes. It's really a case where if people want to store it, they can store it. If people don't want to, they don't need to. Now, the challenge with that is there has been a limit on the amount of data that can be sent through, as well as the number of op returns per transaction. So really, in terms of the data that we're talking about, think of a medium-sized sentence in the English language is kind of the amount of data you can actually put that's prunable. And the challenge is, for a lot of people, they feel we should lift the restrictions on that to make sure that people have the opportunity to use this as the primary mechanism to put data on chain, and the fact that it's prunable, etc. But the challenge with that is, at what point do you make that arbitrary, or do you cause even more issues with regards to relaying those transactions, given the fact that it does have a cost on the network side to relay those type of transactions, given the size. So there are conversations around that. But I say, in general, really, without getting too much into the specifics on the technical side, the larger debate, in my opinion, is on two fronts, or maybe three. One is, what is the difference between the laws that we want to govern on the consensus side versus on the standardness side? Because for a lot of people now, as a counter argument to those that are talking about the anti-spam filtering, they are of the opinion that technically the standardness rules could be argued as a form of censoring transactions that are otherwise valid, even though, that isn't necessarily the case, but it's an argument that's brought up as a counter argument to the anti-spam crowd. And I think really the argument is, are we looking at getting rid of these standardness rules? And are we looking at integrating some of the standardness rules that we feel should be more on the consensus side? Or are we just getting rid of all standardness rules and then just keeping consensus rules? So there's that aspect of the debate. And then there's a larger overarching aspect of the debate, which is around Bitcoin is very, very difficult to navigate in terms of maximizing freedom, but also ensuring that, practically speaking, people can participate in this freedom enterprise. So, talking about resource requirements for running nodes, we're talking about the interaction between, transactions getting relayed to miners versus around nodes, which standardness rules affect. So, I think one other aspect that plays, which is the third component, in my opinion, is the rise of Bitcoin DeFi. If there is such a category that you can define. And I think that's what's pushing the boundaries of these conversations to be had more materially than previous years, in the sense that, is Bitcoin a protocol for money or is it a protocol for data, essentially? And for some of the folks in the ecosystem, they do feel that there is a middle ground, in the sense that the status quo does lean into Bitcoin maintaining its core principle as a protocol for money, but allowing for a less destructive way of putting data in a way that doesn't mess up with that core functionality. And that boils down into kind of a fourth corollary, in my opinion, which is, how do we define what exactly is Bitcoin moving forward, even at the consensus level? Because there are some consensus rules that are a lot more, I'd say, defining of what Bitcoin is ontologically speaking, versus other things like that might be a bit more arbitrary. So more materially, things like the 21 million coins consensus rule versus some other more minutiae details about how to verify transactions. So I think, two fronts, as long as we make sure that the anti-spam filtering conversation doesn't devolve into, we want to filter all the spam, but then we don't have a rigid definition of what spam is, because then I believe the other camp that's in contestation with these guys do have a good argument, which is, if you can't define clear enough what spam is, then technically that's going to end up being censorship. So I do believe there are legitimate concerns with regards to that. But one thing I say, just to wrap up, is I'm glad this conversation is being had at all these multiple levels. It just shows that the community still cares about Bitcoin, in my opinion. I just feel we need to be a lot more honest and open about exactly what we're arguing, versus some of the shoehorning that I've been seeing around, some of the clamor. Just, Core is acting crazy again. The developers are trying to co-opt Bitcoin. So I think really, as a community, we just have to internally sort this out as continue to. And again, it's just going to be even more arguments like this over time. What meaningfully is Bitcoin versus what we feel should be Bitcoin.
Yeah, appreciate you running through that. It's very helpful context. I won't pretend to, understand. Not understand. Like, I feel good about certain opinions I have. I don't have strong ones on this, other than sharing a few thoughts. One is, Guy Swan. One is, yes, it's amazing that people still care, and it makes sense because this asset's never been bigger, right? $2 trillion, like you said, it affects people. People actually could potentially die. Like, that's how big money is and the impact it has on individuals. And Guy Swan had a great quote of like, "Hey, you can say whatever you want, but we all still care," which is kind of just nice to recognize. The other one that ties into it is, I think there's something to, you start to learn in life, whether you get older or run businesses, that like the devil is sometimes better than the devil you don't. And this reminds me of this when it comes to Bitcoin is working as money, at least today. And these notions of, well, second and third order consequences are not always well understood or appreciated. And if we're going for money, that is something that I don't think people discuss enough of, like, well, if it's working today and there's any chance it may not work tomorrow, we should all take a pause. I don't think that's fully recognized by a lot of people. It's not to say things shouldn't change. It's just to recognize that at a very base level of what's the prize. And I think that the best, if anybody's listening, to look at John from Zapright had a really great tweet that was, Bitcoin's not a simple database. That's the blockchain. Bitcoin is money, of which a simple database is just one small part. If this is truly your stance, you don't understand what Bitcoin is. And then Parker had a subsequent tweet that said, this is good framing. If you can't accept that Bitcoin is money and instead look at it as only a simple database to store value, you're looking at to solve problems in different ways, which, independent of that being a right framing or wrong, I think that's the crux of where a lot of this comes, is is money the only thing you're concerned with because everything else is a derivative of that if you fix the money, or are you trying to do multiple things? Because if you try to do multiple things, well, then you're always going to have trade-offs with the most optimal outcome for it to be money. And we have to agree almost what's the point of this thing? And so anyway, I think that's at least my take on it. It's if it's working today and there's a chance it doesn't work tomorrow and we're all competing to be money and it's working to be money today, well, why would you do anything to it if there's not consensus around it?
Yeah, there's a couple we could take this in a ton of different directions too. But one thing to understand also is that there is a spam mitigation policy in play right now, which is essentially just you have to pay miner fees. And based on looking at the mempool, I can look at it right now. There are less than 3,000 transactions in it. And looking over the past day, a lot of the blocks aren't even full. So it's really important to note that you could always, it's all relative, but there's not a ton of demand for, block space and inscriptions and storing data within the blockchain. So that's just important to note, and it's not necessarily the most biggest deal that is very existential at the moment, but it's telling just that there's a lot of very heated, controversial opinions going on right now all across the space for something that, in my view, isn't all that big of a deal, and there will be much larger implications longer on, whether it's quantum computing and et cetera. And, the fractions of people that care about different aspects of Bitcoin is going to significantly change over time as it gets larger too. There's, and there's overlapping here, but a lot of people just care about like Lightning payments technology. Some only care about store of value. Some care about the DeFi, et cetera, on Bitcoin. There are, some that I'm sure there are like devs out there that are, funded by, countries that actually want to see Bitcoin fail. There's going to be a lot of different fractions out there in terms of people who have different opinions about what Bitcoin should be. And, trying to please everybody isn't going to work ever.
Yeah, I mean, my kind of take on all of this going back 12 to 24 months, when I think a lot of this actually started to emerge as a discussion around inscriptions and ordinals, and now we've gotten to this point of an actual policy change proposal. But going back over the past 2 years, my take has always been sort of like, long term, I don't know if this really matters, because I think non-financial transactions get priced out ultimately. And so there, as you're alluding to, Liam, like the sort of free market of transaction fees will take care of this ultimately. But I did want to go back to one distinction and just a sort of question around clarifying what the change actually is being proposed. Because in my understanding, basically what's being proposed is, and I'll pull up a tweet that I thought captured some of this, but effectively people can put arbitrary data on the chain today, but they do it through the witness data. And so I think what is being proposed, and please correct me if I'm misunderstanding this, Abu, is like we're saying just get rid of that limit, so that instead of putting it in the witness data, people can just put arbitrary data in op return, and it would be basically getting rid of the fences in this photo. Like people are already putting data on chain. Is the thinking that this proposal would make it basically a cleaner, more efficient way of doing it by in some way opening the floodgates, removing that fence, but making it more efficient on chain? Is that part of the argument? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, certainly. I think this definitely captures it to a certain extent. So the change I believe from Peter Todd is proposing is kind of twofold. One is getting rid of, again, it's based on the proposal from the mailing list, but getting rid of the restrictions on how many of these type of op returns. So the clean version of putting data on chain can be attached per transaction, and also the actual limit on the data that can be attached to these op return codes. So I think in a way it definitely is a case of expanding the mechanism that's a lot cleaner, or I should say the cleanest, to add data on chain. But again, because of that change itself is why the conversation evolved, or I guess progressed to, well, why do we even have op return right now, like you mentioned, right, given the fact that people are still evading that. And that was a convo, honestly, that was had as a result of, well, I should say at the time that op return was proposed, I think by Luke and some of the other folks in the community. And the thinking really was, we might as well make this as straightforward and with the least amount of consequences moving forward of affecting the chain with regards to persistent data being there versus prune data. And I think it's just an extension of that conversation, or maybe you could say a part two to a certain extent, of further increasing that scope to ensure that we capture a lot more of that that's being dangerously done. But at the same time too, like they still wouldn't necessarily, like people can still be able to put these transactions to miners again, even if you do increase the op return. So really, with the change, the hope is just that this will be done cleanly through that. And that's why some of the conversations also been around just getting rid of the operator for at least a very small group of folks on the ground, versus even just the standardness rules, like I mentioned, which play a part into this of why we even have anti-spam filtering to begin with. So I think there are a lot of nuances here and there. There are a lot of disanalogies and pretty accurate analogies too at the same time. So I think over the coming weeks, you'll likely see a dying down of this conversation from just the sheer heat that it has currently to something more technical, which typically happens with core. To propose a change, people go out, complain, shout, cause issues, and then it revolves back into being fully technical again. So I think likely two things will likely happen. Either this PR gets closed because it's controversial, or it gets too heated, or there isn't too much, maybe a source of signal, or it needs to be rescoped. Or it could be jammed through and then cause us to even have more material conversations about what exactly is Bitcoin and what it should be. Because while this might just be a technical minutiae for a lot of the community, it's changes like these that could have a longer term effect with regards to undoing all the issues that will likely come as a result of a consequence of these type of changes being proposed or included, versus just infighting between the community members.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that's super helpful. And I guess where my mind goes is like, so as you articulated, this is a policy change, not a consensus change. And so in terms of sort of how the development community works, core and other developers, can you sort of walk through the difference between sort of the amount of consensus roughly that one needs to push forward a policy change like this versus a consensus change, and why, as you just articulated, like maybe it just sort of dies down, it doesn't get merged, or they force it through. Can you like add color on like what that forcing it through would look like and what that means relative to like something that was an actual consensus change, and the difference in those two processes, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at.
No, for sure. I mean, there's definitely a lot of context that I'll likely have to butch just to convey this succinctly. But with regards to how changes get pushed through, it is a very, very dynamic process on the core project. It's not as straightforward as we have 20 ACKs, which is acknowledgements, versus NACKs, disagreements, and then seeing just materially what's the count and then just merging. If each time there is a change, depending on how complex, depending on the bandwidth of folks reviewing, it depends on that group of folks taking a look at that time. So whether it's consensus versus non-consensus, the main distinction I would say is there's definitely a lot more scrutiny, just naturally speaking, if we're talking about consensus versus something like policy. And then at the same time too, there have been situations where, this is more historical than pretty recent, where some changes that, even though in retrospect might have been something that should have been taken, not necessarily more seriously, but should have had a lot more eyeballs taken or taken a look at, just get merged. And there are situations where things that might seem trivial, again, like something like this, that have just so many eyeballs looking at it. I think really the difference is very dynamic. It's not black and white in the sense that this is exactly how it works each time. Say it depends on a case by case basis, but for something like, let's say Taproot, for example, there was already a consensus on the actual change itself. And ironically, the biggest delay came from how to deploy that change. So there are kind of weird instances like that where there is agreement on the change itself, but maybe the mechanism of deploying that change, or even sometimes just the change is agreed upon. And then, so when I talk about the forcing it down the line, I mean, kind of goes into the censorship question. So it could be a case where and there is noise really if you look at the pull request from people outside of Twitter or people who actually aren't contributors on the space, which just created GitHub accounts just to comment. So if it's a case where everyone within that noise category is expanded and we have former contributors also being included as noise, and then comments get deleted all the way up to the only thing remaining is essentially all the pro arguments for that change itself, then that could naturally also swing some of the maintainers or some of the folks on the ground that are reviewing this code as like, okay, this isn't as controversial. So that's what I mean by like forcing it down the line. I don't expect that'll be the case. I still have I don't necessarily say maybe trust, but I do lean into the competency and the level of vested interest that core developers also do have in the project, because people also forget that these are folks that use Bitcoin on a daily as well, that also hold Bitcoin. So it's not like it's a random set of people that just care about the project for caring's sake. So I think that's what we're leading into, or I guess leaning into in terms of this sorting itself out. And kind of how the mechanism is or the process for making changes and kind of accepting them emerges.
Hey everyone, hope you're enjoying the podcast episode with Abu Bakr. He always brings a ton of great insights and technical knowledge to a show that maybe we don't always get into deep technicals. Quick word from Onramp. Want to let you guys know we have some big, exciting updates coming forward in the coming days. If you want to sign up to our research to get a sneak peek, please do. And also, we offer financial services across the board, not only multi-institution custody. So if you're ready to self-sign up, you can go through our self-onboarding. That's something most people don't know. But once you onboard, you actually can get the ability to trade, lend against your Bitcoin, get a tax-advantaged Bitcoin account via your IRA, as well as set up inheritance. And it's all backed by Lloyd's of London with a $100 million policy. If you're curious on what we're building, want to get involved, please shoot me a note. Love chatting with everyone. Michael at onrampbitcoin.com. Now on to the rest of the episode. Thanks.
Gotcha.
Yeah, thanks for running through that. I mean, I'll probably get crap for this. I don't agree with it, but I can see where Saylor's stance on funding devs comes from, where he's like, hey guys, maybe we don't need all this money out there floating around with ideas on changes to the Bitcoin protocol. He likes how it works. He likes how it works today. And just describing what you just said probably make his eyes glaze over. No, I appreciate you running through. I think maybe switching gears, something I wanted to call out that you referenced in Q4 when you came on the show last was the interest in Bitcoin and stablecoins sitting next to each other. And I believe if I recall correctly, there was that interest in seeing what that looks like. And I think that's something that we've been talking about more. You don't see a lot of Bitcoin companies sitting with, infrastructure able to have BTC and stablecoins. But given, this new administration, the new global flows that have come about, Tether, what we're talking about with, whether it's treasury markets or exposure into the U.S. markets, there was a report that came out from the Treasury Department that was actually pretty good from a government agency. It shows that over the course of the next 3 years, roughly, they expect stable coin supply to be up to $2 trillion. And then it also had some, I think here, referencing a little bit of the different markets and sectors that it would impact, from tokenized deposits all the way to CBDCs. We don't have to talk about the exact report. We'll link it to it in the show notes. But just curious, Abu, as you're thinking about, you're investing, you're looking at the global landscape in Nigeria as well as outside. How has that kind of progressed since our last discussion? What are innovative things you're looking at, interested in, as it relates to Bitcoin, and then like digital banking around stable coins?
No, for sure. I think we're definitely past the whole, hesitation in the ecosystem with regards to stablecoins. Because initially, I know some of the conversations were around using Lightning vis-a-vis stablecoins, and then that just materialized, I guess, towards the end of Q4, like you mentioned. The flows, pretty much the volumes, kind of dictating exactly where the market is heading, which is that a lot of that really has been captured by stablecoins as opposed to Lightning, which makes a lot of sense, and it's a lot more practical, really, if we're talking about it more materially, given the fact that we're just converting, like I mentioned, I think in the last time we spoke, all the demand that traditionally would have gone to US dollars into stable coins pretty much. So it does make a lot of sense. I think what we're most keen on looking at in terms of the company side is infrastructure that, like you mentioned, has the capacity to handle both Bitcoin as well as stable coins. But I think, at least personally, outside of the kind of looking at it from the VC side, is making sure that there still is that distinction made between the two, as opposed to maybe blending them down the line in terms how they work, some of the engineering side about how these interactions should be dictated to. Because at the end of the day, as much as a lot of these flows are just being translated from stock, kind of locked up, I guess, liquidity from FX, it is important to note that there are still dollars, essentially. So if we're really looking at financial freedom, etc., and things like that, there still needs to be, at least mentally, in terms of the mental models that a lot of these entrepreneurs have of where they'd like to lean users in the either direction, and kind of clarifying exactly what these assets are for users, practically speaking, whether it's on self-custody side or even if it's on inheritance and things like that. So I say making those distinctions very, very clear and solid right now is what would make the space a lot more easy to navigate down the line, vis-a-vis having even more complexity, both from the builder side as well as the entrepreneurs, the marketing, the language, because I think language is very, very important in terms of how you communicate the products and services, and that kind of sets the expectation at a community level, or I guess at an ecosystem level, which could either make or break in terms of the trust people place in the asset itself and the builders and things like that. So I'd say those are kind of the things we're looking at on the VC side, and kind of personally where I hope.
Yeah, it's something I was thinking about. It's like on the bookends, there's the infrastructure being laid, but it's like, how does it connect? And what I mean by that is like, so you have like cold storage solutions, whether it's Onramp or like collaborative custody or even self custody with like pure, you holding a hardware device. And then over here, you have the way that you pay for goods and services globally. It can be in the US, and you have, whether it's Apple Pay, cards. And it's like, how do you, as more of like, I think we're all here living in the future and people listening by holding larger and larger amounts of wealth in BTC and understanding it's different than a stable coin or the US dollar. But we still live in a dollar denominated world where you have liabilities. And how do you actually stay in BTC longer, but then ultimately can get to like some form of wallet that sits here that has some basically ability to convert to USD or whatever the stable coin is when you're spending it. So you can stay in BTC the longest if you want. You can always move to dollars as well. But there's that connectivity doesn't fully exist yet. And it makes sense because most people don't even know why they would want to hold the majority of their wealth in BTC and spend from it. But we're going to that world, and we're going to that world where, and that's where like I kind of, I've always thought like stablecoins weren't as interesting until it just hit me like, well, the reason why stablecoins have been interesting, and specifically Tether, is because it's helped global flows into BTC because it's digital. And so then you take that to every other capital market or every other consumer, flow of funds. And then that actually applies across the board. If you can put stablecoins, get your dollars into stablecoins, and then next to the scarcest digital asset we've ever seen in Bitcoin, that's just going to further accelerate that transfer of wealth from dollars into BTC, and then back and forth will naturally happen. And so, yeah, I think that there's still a huge amount of opportunities that I've been thinking about to help bridge those gaps globally.
100%. And I think maybe just tying the entire conversation into a neat bow would be, there's definitely a lot we need to do on the regulatory side, because that affects how governments permit a lot of this innovation. General space is built on permissionless innovation. There are ways in which you can still maintain using Bitcoin outside of that, but just the sheer amount of people that would be affected by adversarial regulation is really why I would care about regulation. And two is really kind of taking off of the sailor conversation, broadly also the conversation around the controversies recently. I think it's important to note for folks listening and watching as well that software generally isn't a thing where it's done, or like other things in life, like software is either not maintained or maintained. So for something like Bitcoin that we're planning to have into the next couple of decades, it's very, very important to take it as software that needs consistent maintenance, not just for it to keep working as it is, but for it to even work better than previously what we've been enjoying, and to kind of iron out what it is for Bitcoin to be Bitcoin for generations to come. I think that leads into obviously diversifying funding for developers, because as much as developers are integrity and very competent, there are ways in which they can be influenced from funding. You have a lot of them concentrated in a single place, for example. And I say that conversation leads into things like, B-Trust and the work that we do. And trying to distinguish between funding and dictating to the space vis-a-vis funding and kind of enabling that. And kind of where we lean on that is ensuring that we pump out developers that are extremely competent, honest, and have a high degree of philosophical understanding of exactly what Bitcoin is and how we can persist that into the next couple of decades. So I'd say that's one of the things I think people should keep in mind when these conversations come up, and at least for capital allocators as well, to kind of look at where they'd like to provide the most value. Is it in the case of funding companies, in the case of maybe putting their stake in terms of funding developers or organizations that do this developer funding, and kind of how they can think about these things. And lastly, really on the stablecoin Bitcoin distinction, I think you put it very, very succinctly. It's making sure that we know what direction of the future we'd like to have a vested interest in terms of the infrastructure, and kind of how we like to direct ourselves, see having Bitcoin to be everything else. And how in the meantime we can graduate that more consciously and more realistically, practically around as many jurisdictions as possible, with the sole aim, honestly, of just allowing for freedom to kind of, right now we have to contend with all the antinomies of freedom versus slavery or fiat, etc., as folks like to express. So I'd say those are the main key points people should be cognizant of looking into these conversations across everything just discussed.
Yeah, that's a great recap. And I think the thing that stood out there is about the developers and just like individuals coming up is remembering what, at least Bitcoin is, or explaining the importance of money, because I think like when you conflate technology and, iteration, and because that's general, right, for technology versus like money, they're fundamentally different. And I think that's probably like a substrate of what's lost in this discussion of optimizing versus thinking through from first principles, what are we trying to change?
100%. So with that in mind, hopefully folks can navigate as effectively as possible the ecosystem. But then again, this is the beauty of having a decentralized project. All the opinions, all the folks around the world. It's healthy to check in everyone's biases and also everyone's motivations, and where their head is at. So we all have to keep ourselves accountable.
I love it. I know we had a shorter rip today, but we've grown our following. So if you want anyone to figure out, where to find you or want to shill anything, let them know. I know I think you may have closed the fundraising process already, but any updates around that would be helpful for people to know to find you, get in contact.
No, for sure. On the fund side, definitely can reach out to us either on X or even our contact at rcrsv.xyz. If you're looking at personally, I drop quite a lot of articles on Forbes. You can take a look at that. Follow me on Nostr as well as X. And other than that, I'd say just generally keeping tabs on what's happening in this part of the world. So specifically Africa and the rest of the global south, because I feel it's going to dictate and kind of set the precedent for everywhere else in terms of innovation, regulation, as well as where development.
Love it. We need a recap. I want to talk, been going down the gold rabbit hole and figuring out how that's going to flow with everything. We didn't even get to touch on that in China. So we need to get you back on at some point.
Now, for sure. Looking forward to that. It's a very interesting combo. We still have a lot of gold bugs on the ground. So
yeah, the guy's been hearing, they're tired of hearing about that from me.
Michael loves his gold. He loves his shiny rock.
No, the angle is that gold and Bitcoin are going to persist much longer than both sides want them to or think, right, is the angle. So till TBD will part 2 with Abu coming soon.
Fair enough. Looking forward to it. Thanks again for having me, guys.
Thanks, man.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Later. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the show. If you found the information valuable, please share the episode with a friend or leave a rating on your favorite podcast app. All the links we discussed in today's show will be in the show notes inside your podcast app. Before we finish, a quick reminder that Onramp Media is for informational and entertainment purposes only, and nothing should be construed as investment or legal advice. Regardless of where you are on your Bitcoin journey, we'd love to hear from you. Visit onrampbitcoin.com/contact to schedule a consultation with one of our private client advisors.